I'm Vonda Woodall,
And I'm Jordan Najafi.
and the chapter we chose is Chapter 31 on Emotional and Spiritual Giftedness. Emotional giftedness is best defined as expressed in helping others, alleviating distress, opposing unfairness, fighting injustice, and resilience in overcoming abuse. It predates emotional intelligence, and it's illustrated when gifted students initiate large-scale altruistic projects and promote social justice.
Emotional intelligence was first formulated by Salovey and Mayer in 1990 and eventually developed into a theory. They developed a multi-factor emotional intelligence scale that measures emotional intelligence abilities. And they found out with their results that emotional is the high end of emotional intelligence with an identity distinct from intellectual giftedness, showing that emotional giftedness is not necessarily tied in with intellectual giftedness.
The table that's used to identify emotional intelligence is shown here. And some of the highlights from the table, first part, perception, appraisal, and expression of emotions. Another aspect is emotional facilitation of thinking. The third part is understanding and analyzing emotional information, employing emotional knowledge, and lastly, regulation of emotion.
There are several other characteristics of the emotionally gifted. These students often see through pretense and double standards even when posed by adults. They're often met with opposition and ridicule. They have unpopular opinions that can often lead to positive maladjustment, which just means that they're true to their self. They have universal ideals of compassion in opposition to other people's self-interests and prejudices. Basically, they stick to what they believe in and they're going to stand up for it. There are several examples of this. Howard's 1994 study looked at 5 highly gifted 5-year-old girls. They had an advanced level of understanding how human relationships work, even in adults. They understood the difference between people dying, but puppets don't, even though they represent human beings. They understood that you could have simultaneous yet conflicting feelings, and the example they used was being sad at leaving one home, but excited at the same time about moving on to another opportunity. They understand that behavior may not clearly reveal someone's true inner feelings. Personalities are based on inner feelings rather than actions, which calls for effort to maintain friendships. Despite what people do, sometimes they feel differently than they act. This type of understanding is only typically found in children twice their age or older, so usually 10 years old or above that, and these girls were all 5. Their examples include stories of gifted kids fighting crime, taking social action against an injustice, or saving the environment where other adults were not. And most gifted children who take part in these types of active youth leadership are often a part of a group devoted to helping others rather than working alone.
Some criteria and situations suggest that emotional giftedness should include emotional survival against all odds. For example, child abuse or assault at a very young age, in addition to high end of emotional intelligence. Relating back to the simulation that we did last week, we were looking at some of the family situations when we were trying to identify our gifted or our top 5 gifted students. And maybe this is something that we should consider taking into account. One of the questions we're looking at is emotional giftedness truly advanced emotional intelligence? Meaning, is their action in the realm of emotion? Are they perceiving, understanding, and managing their emotions? Or is it just the advanced processing of information to solve a problem? Based on the actions of the young children that they studied, the support for that is that the answer would be yes, and that emotional giftedness is advanced or gifted emotional intelligence.
We're now moving on to spiritual giftedness, which includes experiences of ecstasy, timelessness, God in everything, sense of self beyond your physical reality, and even techniques for achieving heightened consciousness. Spiritual giftedness is an old phenomenon, but the more recent phenomenon is recognizing childhood spirituality giftedness. There are several measures for this, for spiritual constructs in the Spiritual Orientation Inventory, the Mystical Experiences Scale, the Peak Experiences Scale, and the Spiritual Well-Being Scale.
Part of the identification process of spiritual intelligence or spiritual giftedness could be the capacity to transcend the physical and material, the ability to experience in heightened states of consciousness, the ability to sanctify everyday experience, the ability to utilize spiritual resources to solve problems, the capacity to be virtuous, the conscious recognition that physical reality is embedded in a larger, multidimensional reality in which we interact consciously and unconsciously on a moment-to-moment basis, and the conscious pursuit of psychological health, not only for ourselves, but also for the sake of the global community.
There's actually a lot of data of spiritual experiences in students. In a pool of over 1,000 cases of those collected childhood spiritual experiences, it came out that they can occur as early as ages 3 and 4, sometimes even earlier than that. 10% of those cases occurred before the age of 5. The majority of them occurred at 70% between ages 5 and 15, and 19% of them occurred after age 15. They can occur spontaneously, no matter where you're at, whether you're sitting in the car or at church. Those cases also occurred in both religious and non-religious households, which was very interesting to both Vonda and I. They can often initiate a spiritual search later in life, and they also give a person strength to deal with tragic losses and reversals in life. The vast majority of these spiritual experiences that were collected were joyous, but there were very few that were unsettling or frightening, often when kids were asking questions about life and death without any authority to direct them. Some examples can include wordless prayers, achieving states of calmness, focusing on visual patterns, achieving mystical states. Children don't often talk about these spiritual experiences because they think people won't believe them, especially adults, and they're sometimes ridiculed. The question of authenticity actually has a lot of strong evidence to support the strength of children's memory, and the respondents themselves were very, very emphatic that the experience was undeniable, it was pre-verbal, and not subject to interpretation, editing, or alteration.
Rebecca Nye introduced the concept of relational consciousness to capture children's unusual level of consciousness or perceptiveness in regard with how they felt connected with the world around them, people, their own self, and God. There are 4 dimensions of relational consciousness that could possibly unify emotional intelligence and spiritual intelligence and give them a sense of overall connectedness. The first one is God consciousness. The child perceives God's presence in everything. Praying to God in person, experiencing God's presence, often claim God as a simplistic answer to questions of world origin or processes. There's people consciousness. The child perceives spiritual consciousness as their actions go far beyond the idea of being nice or getting along with others. There's a consciousness for true fairness and kindness that perforates the typical. The third one is self-consciousness, evident in knowledge that the child's identity extends beyond the physical body. Questions of origin and death accompany this. And then world consciousness, evident via the sense of wonder and joy drawn from the natural world, sky, visions bigger than oneself, seeing lights of city from a hilltop are an example of world consciousness.
So, how do we relate all of this spiritual giftedness and emotional giftedness back to gifted education in and of itself. We need to achieve the proper balance between talent development and personal growth by incorporating emotional and spiritual intelligence development in our curriculum. And our discussion question is, if the goal of education is to develop each child's potential to the fullest, how can we incorporate emotional and spiritual intelligence and giftedness in development?